On today's episode, we learn about how only socialism can provide food for children, how subsidized housing, baby formula, and public schools are capitalism. We examine the relationship between inflation and corporate profits, how Western culture is uniquely violent, and finally, how the government's superior claim to your property is okay. This is Cringe Posts. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast. This is the podcast where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we see in our feeds each week, and we lay them out for you, show where they went wrong, and try to have a little bit of a laugh along the way. My name's Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie, and before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our show. It really helps us grow our show, and we've been growing, and that's been really cool, and we really appreciate it. And if you are listening to this podcast on, Apple or Spotify, and you want to see some of the memes or any of the posts that we're going through visually, you can go to cringepost.com and check out the visual show companion. Before we start poking fun at other people, we like to kind of go back through our past and see, where we've gone wrong, just to show that, hey, we're good sports about all this stuff. And today, I've got Donald Kimball posting in 2013. He posted this picture, and the picture wrote, I feel like I'm at a point in my life where I know I need to advance the main quest, but instead I faff about doing side quests because the main quest is intimidating, and I don't feel like I've leveled up enough to be able to handle it. And right before we started the show, we were talking about how this is 2013, freshman year at school, and I think, I fell into this category a lot too, that because my life experience up until, I guess any point, is of everything in the past, I have to find some way to relate it. And why this is kind of cringe to me is it's just the only life experience I can relate to is playing video games.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so quirky. My life is a video game and I'm leveling up. Don't be such a dork. That's so lame. I enjoy gaming. I'm still a major, gamer. I'm still a dork and all that, but at least I don't have the gall to post it. So apparently, I think it's also just funny because now, as circumstances in my life are my main priorities, and the older you get, the wider your perspective is. I try to remember that. It's kind of the recognition of you don't know what you don't know, and what seems like it is the most major big deal in front of you now, you'll look back on and realize it, it's probably going to be okay. You need to pay attention to these things and deal with them. But having a mature attitude about that kind of thing is important. And thinking that I need to advance the main quest your freshman year of high school or of college. It's I
don't think you even know what the main quest is at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Dude, you've got, I did 3 years at NU, and it's you've got, by the time this is 2.5 more years of basically guided instruction where you don't have to worry about finding a place to live. You don't have to worry about, other than your, on-campus job, paying for things like your living and your food and all that. And it's just so funny that I made such a big deal and I can relate to it in this quirky gamer way. Just as the icing on top there.
I think that life is just a constant cycle of feeling overwhelmed in the present moment, but not realizing that the next season is going to make the current moment seem so small and insignificant. Right. I had a buddy who was in college, and he was just talking about how overwhelmed he was with all the different assignments and things. And I was like, dude, the real world in work is finals week every week, but if you don't pass though, you starve to death, right? So imagine that type of pressure. And then obviously I don't have a kid yet, but I've heard that, kind of the next season of life is having a kid. And then it makes everything that was before having a kid seem really easy. But that's just, I think people tend to, us included, obviously, tend to have such short-sightedness and only focus on the present. So yeah, I thought it was a cute little look back into Donald's past perceptions.
Yeah, well, the reason, of course, why you have to have every week is finals week, and if you don't make it, you starve. That's all because of capitalism, right?
Yes, exactly. And speaking of that, we've got a post by Anticapitalism. It's the SpongeBob meme where he's trying to look at two different pages. On one page, it says socialism is when no food, and on the other page, it says giving free food to children would be socialism. And this is a really common way that socialists argue for their programs. They basically equate some good thing with it only being able to be accomplished through socialism, right? No one is saying that giving free food to children is socialism. We're saying giving free food to children is giving free food to children because it's only free to the child that receives it. It costs you something to give it to them, right? And that's the whole principle that socialism ignores is there's no such thing as free lunch. Right? Someone pays for it. It's just a matter of who is going to pay for it. And in socialism, you forcefully take it from someone and allocate it to someone else. The point that you make all the time when these type of posts come up that I really enjoy is that in a totally free market society, people will claim things like, well, what would happen to people that are going to starve? And your point is, well, what happens to the people that care about those people today? They don't just go away, right? There's always going to be people that care about people that are going to starve and care about the less needy. Private charity is the most efficient way of distributing resources as it currently stands. And imagine what would happen if private charity was able, and the people that donate to private charities had more money to actually give to those private charities without the force of government regulation and taxes and all that stuff.
Yeah, to speak to that point, before I move to the meme itself, they often worry. Well, it's like, oh, there's so the people who care might still be there, but they won't have any of the resources, right? Without the tax payments, without the infrastructure, and it's like, well, you think that, and then you realize how much waste goes into government programs and how much more efficient private charities are, and if you make these pleas where people aren't so deferring to the government to take care of these problems, and you reinstill societal responsibility, for individuals to think, I've got to take care of my community around me, and I can't just outsource that to the government. There will still be plenty of people who have the means, but they maybe don't have the ability or the time to help, who will want to give that, right? Who will want to give those resources. And now that gets effectively distributed so much better than it does in the current system. So while you may lose the compulsory payments from taxation, you gain efficiency in the in the ways that private charities operate, the way the efficiencies and the abilities of people who actually care and aren't just government workers who are on an inefficient payroll. And you again, but all of this has to some degree be paired with individual responsibility for sure. It's like if we just flipped a switch and made our culture completely governmentless. There would be a big wake-up call for people, because right now we are very much trained to, my taxes take care of that. I can just sort of not worry about doing any of the work myself. So I think to answer to that point, like, you do need a cultural waking up, but part of that waking up is realizing that the responsibility is on you as an individual, not on the government. And outsourcing more responsibility to the government creates this self-defeating loop of relying on the government, therefore no one takes responsibility, which means that you have to rely on the government more, which means no one takes responsibility, etc. So that's just to the charity point. But to this meme specifically, the other thing about it is, it's trying to play this gotcha game of like, you're saying there's no food in socialism, but also if we give free food through like government programs to people, then you're saying that's also socialism. Wow, socialism apparently is when there's no food and when you give away free food. And it's so funny because it's like, well, when we say socialism is when no food, what we're saying is socialism means that you lack the resources to create a producing market that not only meets the needs currently of food, but also overproduces and makes it so that there can be expansive resources for cheaper and access grows to food. Socialism invariably can't get the measures that the market provides, and the market being, of course, just human need and human want back and forth for resources. So they don't have those signals, so you can never get enough food. And if you get too much food, then it rots and spoils because the pricing is wrong and all those kinds of things. So yeah, it's like if you have a government program that distributes food to children, yeah, that's socialism because of the control of the means of the production. But it eventually does run out of food. It's not that it simultaneously does have food and doesn't have food. It's that yeah, it has food for a little bit until it doesn't because it's socialist. So you take the excesses. It's like you implement a socialist program off the back of a free market production of food. You know, the market has created this excess of wealth, and then you implement this socialist policy. And then if you get rid of that free market component, then you do run out of food and you don't have that food to give out from the program. So this meme relies on the existence of the free market to have the means, essentially, to implement the socialist program. Much like the socialist ideas themselves, it's sort of a leech that relies upon its the supposed thing it wants to take down in order for it to make this joke, which ultimately it's one leads to the other.
Yeah, it's for kind of a little bit more economic nerds, like it's the concept of Keynesian demand, right? Like Keynes thought that, and he posited, and a lot of our politicians implement this type of policy today, that demand creates production, which is just totally not true. Because, as Hayek and other, Austrian economists have demonstrated, it's production actually creates demand, because if you had an island and they only had so many resources, by default the amount that they could trade to somewhere else for something else is the amount of resources they currently have. So the only way to create demand is for there to be more resources on that island for them to trade away to get other things. And that thought process, I can't remember exactly, I think it's called effective demand, is the thought process that, well, if we, have kids that need food and there are less people working, then like the market will ramp up production to meet that demand. It's like, no, eventually, because of the inequilibrium of all the different inputs and outputs, and because, certain costs aren't being met and certain things that need to happen for food to continue to be produced aren't met and sustained, you'd end up with, there is no food, right? It's the, I saw this, the Bugs Bunny, meme where they've got the communist flag and the American flag behind it. Mm-hmm. And I saw this one, it made me laugh. It was the American flag, it's like work or starve. And then under communism, it's work and starve, right, which is really true, right? Because someone has to produce this food. There's no such thing as free food. There's no such thing as free lunch. It has to be produced. And if everyone is getting free food and no one is making food, or there's no expanded production where one person can produce the equivalent amount of food for 10 people, there's going to be eventually no food.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this is this meme is a great example of one of the sort of fallacies that we highlight from time to time. I think we even highlighted it maybe on the last episode, where you take a term and you use it in different contexts, but then equate the two. So, as people say with like the term pro-life, well, you can't be pro-life unless you support all these government policies. It's like, no, pro-life in this particular context means something than the vague general term pro-life. The political context of pro-life means a very specific thing. And that's what's happening in this meme. So if you see things like this and you're like, well, is that contradictory? Think about how the term socialism is being used. Because, for instance, socialism is when no food. No one has ever said no food equals socialism. It's always that socialism leads to there being no food. That's the claim being made by people. Is that with socialism, you don't have the proper price controls, you don't have the proper demand controls, you don't have the signals being sent to the market to provide enough food, so you run out. That's what we say about socialism. And then giving free food to children would be socialism. Again, taking that to its most generous interpretation. Some sort of welfare program that provides, government mandated compliance to distribute food to children, being a socialist program, is an entirely different thing, saying that, controlling the means of distribution and redirecting resources away from people compulsory is an aspect of socialism. So yes, that is a socialist program, and socialist programs lead to the state when there is no food. But he's trying to hold, this meme's trying to hold these things at the same time and say, oh, you can't believe both things at once because they're contradictory. When, again, you're just misusing the term socialism as though we are saying that they are the same thing at the same time, when it's saying, nope, the socialism leads to no food, and distributing by force resources compulsory is a socialist ideology.
It's a great point. All right, moving on to our next post. We've got a series of tweets, and this person writes, if you have kids in the U.S., One, you can't house them because the rent jumped 100% during a pandemic. Two, you can't feed them because formula is being produced and contaminated in facilities. Three, they're not safe in school because this society produces mass shooters on a constant basis. And if you decide you can't raise a child under any of these conditions, in many places here, you'll be forced to give birth anyway. This is a free and democratic society under capitalism. And when I read that last line, I thought, where is the capitalism? Is it in the public school that they're talking about? Is it in the monopolized baby formula industry that was monopolized by government control? Is it in the rent controlled housing and the inflationary spending that caused all these different rents and housing prices to go up? And this is what's so annoying about these type of posts is that they take the current situation in the United States and they say, yeah, look at all this bad stuff that's happening right now. And you like capitalism? Well, this is capitalism and it's bad. It's like, no, this was all caused by your programs and the things that you want. And if we gave more of it, this would be even worse. It's just a really weird line of logic from the toe. It's like, I don't think there's any, by no measure can you say that we live in a free market society. Everything is controlled. And I mean, we've got a post coming later about ownership. It's like you even the most fundamental thing that you can own, which is a piece of land, you can't actually even own in the United States. So I don't see how any of this stuff that this person criticizes is part of free market capitalism.
Well, and let's if you sort of give them benefit of the doubt, you can say that certain factors of a free market economy are on a sliding scale. To
Sure.
say that we are more free market than China is true, but then you have to make sure that the very problems that you are identifying are caused by this free market to make that claim. And as you pointed out, every single instance of this there are these exceptions to free market exchange. Another great example is look at our the healthcare system, where anything that is socialized in our state and run by this sort of corporate government marriage with insurance providers and government run facilities and things like that, you look at those costs and they skyrocket. And you look at the free market aspects, the more free market aspects of our healthcare, like LASIK and stuff, and prices go down. So you can make the claim that the U.S. has free market components to it, and it does on a sliding scale. But you just got to make sure that every example you don't give has a clear and demonstrable government intervention that's causing these problems. The other aspect of this tweet that's just, it's just so poorly argued is to let's grant them all of the premise that we just debunked. But let's grant them that, okay? So you can't have kids in the U.S., you can't afford to have kids because the house rent increased because of the free market. You can't afford them because you can't feed them formula because of the free market. And they're not safe in schools because of the free market, I guess. All of these things are true. And if you decide you can't raise a child under those conditions in many places here, you'll be forced to not murder your toddler anyway. There is no difference in the argument other than they say you'll be forced to give birth anyway. The entire contention in the pro-life movement is that, abortion is murder. So if you're not contending with that, then this entire argument is completely irrelevant unless you're also willing to argue for the genocide of toddlers because they're expensive. It's so funny because, so many posts try to get around that issue. We looked at one a couple episodes back that said something like, it doesn't matter if it's a life. And at the time, it had made some dumb claim, which we, skillfully and elegantly debunked.
As elegant as your pronunciation of elegantly.
Yeah. But it's like, it's just funny because they don't want to contend with the core argument, because I think it's a very fundamentally uncomfortable truth that you come to when you recognize that the debate hinges on the value of the life. You know, I won't even say that it's alive, because I think a lot of people will recognize that it's alive, that it is alive, but that the value is the full value of a human and the personhood of the baby that is being born. So nothing in this whole thread, it's one of those great arguments that, again, it doesn't make any one point coherently, and it doesn't reason through it. It makes a bunch of claims, and then it says, and then it says, and my link is that it is true. That's kind of the whole argument here. Nothing actually reasons out. This was one of my biggest complaints with people in the college debate scene when I was a judge for college debate, is they would make all of these claims, but they wouldn't link any of the arguments together. And they just say, if Joe Blow enacts policy A, the world will end. And you're saying, like, well, those are two very disconnected things. You have to tell me why that's the case. And so here they say all these things, and it's like, look at these terrible conditions, and if you decide that you can't raise a child because it's not affordable because of these conditions, you're forced to give birth anyway. And you're like, that is not, but the affordability of having a kid has nothing to do with murder. It has absolutely nothing to do with murder unless you are also willing to make the exact same argument and claim for anyone who has any sort of legal ownership and responsibility of another human. Because that is the only comparison here you can make, or not the only comparison. That is the equivalent comparison to make in any of those other contexts, whether you are a caretaker of an elderly person or a parent of a child who has no legal rights yet.
Yeah, and we've talked about it before on the show, but when you're contending with people about whether the baby, you know, a pregnancy is a human life or not, one of the things that's really interesting to me is that the arguments for having an abortion are almost prove, right, that it is a human life, because it's all about, well, I don't know if I'd be able to afford the kid, or my life is going to be a little bit harder because I'm going to have to make a career change where I can be at home, or things like that, or maybe I just don't want to take time away from my career. It's like all of those arguments hinge on the fact that this will be a human at some point, right? And that, like you're saying, then it shifts to, it's like, well, are there some circumstances where we should kill a human? That's the only place you can go with it, and that's clearly where this person decided to take it as well.
Yep.
All right, we got another post by Anticapitalist, and they write, "Don't believe me. The Federal Reserve just reported that U.S. corporate profits are up 25% across the board. So we have the highest inflation in 40 years and the highest corporate profits in 50 years. Only a fool or a liar wouldn't make the common sense connection." And I appreciated this one because this person isn't totally wrong, right? In that they corporate profits being up and inflation being up is a sign of something sinister. They just kind of get it backwards, because what they try to infer from this is that, oh, well, the only reason we have an inflation is not because of money printing. It's because corporations are charging a lot of money, for their things. They can charge more and more and more. That's why their profits are up. It's like, no, that's not how it works. There is something sinister going on, and corporations are benefiting, but they're benefiting from the levers that the government's pulling to print money. So if you Google it, there's this kind of term called like helicopter money, right? When money is printed and you fly it up in a helicopter and you dump it all across the country, certain people get that money first. And the people that get that money first are going to be able to purchase things with the purchasing power that they currently have. But as that money gets put into circulation all around the country, the purchasing power suddenly goes down. So the people that had it first were able to buy assets. Their asset value inflates while everyone else's purchasing power goes down. So when we had, in 2020 and 2021, $6 trillion, basically party to print a bunch of money that got disseminated all across the United States, that's what's causing inflation. And then, on top of that, certain businesses got different types of, bailouts and PPP loans and all these different things that contribute to that bottom line. So yeah, there is something sinister going on. And corporations are reaping the benefits, but they are not the instigators of these crazy things happening. It's the Federal Reserve, and it's the government that's doing it.
The really frustrating thing about this is I'm experiencing what I'd heard had been experienced by people who'd been in the sort of Austrian economics, libertarian liberty wing of politics before I was, right? So, I kind of came in like 2013-ish, a little bit late to the party, but I'm also young, so, forgive me. And I was learning about these concepts, and I'm reading about them from, economists, as well as hearing great people speak about them, from Thomas Sowell to Ludwig von Mises to Ron Paul, etc. And so much of what had happened up here is, I'd come through the 2008 recession and a lot of these economic crises that had happened. And all I'd heard was, we've been warning about this for years. And the funny thing is, having come in after these things, it's very much like you look back on it and you think, yeah, the explanations for these various economic phenomena exist and are explainable through Austrian economic theory and all these kinds of things. So you're like, yeah, this all makes sense. This is good. And then you focus on these concepts in terms that are kind of evergreen in economic theory, such as inflation. And it's like, so my whole life I'm hearing about what inflation is. And then growing up, I understand why inflation is a bad thing. I understand why inflation is an artificial manipulation, not just a natural occurrence with society and government. Because like when you first learn about it, you're like, well, I guess it's because, more things are produced and therefore things get more expensive or something. You don't really think about it. Then you learn from Austrian economists that they're like, hey, this is bad. Stop printing money. And they've been banging this drum for, more than a decade, but at least about a decade since I've been in the liberty movement, right? And now that the thing that we've been saying is going to happen is happening. And we've been saying this for more than 10 years, but I've been hearing it and saying it for like 10 years. Now everyone's saying, it's those greedy corporations. And you just want to tear your hair out. You're like, no, we've been saying this before you guys were worried about all these things happening, that the trajectory we were on with the government printing this money is going to cause bad inflation and it's going to lead to this exact thing happening. And then the COVID hit and Trump signed the bills that printed more money and more bailouts than we, it's something like we've printed 40% of all money in the last 2 years, something insane like that. And you're like, at the start of 2020 or, near the end of 2020, at that point, we were saying this is going to cause massive inflation. And now that it's happening, they're saying, it's those greedy corporations. And you're like, no, we've been predicting this. We've been calling this. We've told you exactly what's going to happen. And what we said was exactly going to happen is happening. Stop it. And so I finally feel like I'm a kindred spirit to some degree, not in the greatest way, but with the forefathers of the liberty movements who felt this way about things like the housing crisis and the 2008 recession and all that sort of thing, where they predicted absolutely everything that happened. Peter Schiff called it all these years ago, and no one listened to him. Everyone made fun of him, and then it happened. And as it happened, and after it happened, everyone still ignores him and makes fun of him, even though he was completely right. And that's where we are right now with inflation, where it's such an obvious truth. And if you'd explain this to anyone before the media and popular opinion pointed at the corporations, they would have said, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you ever watch The Big Short?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I remember in college I watched that with a buddy, and it basically details out the 2008 financial crisis. And at the end of it, they basically say, hey, like all these banks did this stuff, the big crash happened, and oh, by the way, they're back to doing credit default swaps and all these different things. And my buddy that I watched with was like, man, that's crazy. We just need more regulation, to stop them from doing it. And I was like, dude, you missed the whole point of the movie. Like, what these banks, there's literally a scene where one of the guys says, yeah, like we trade these things and we create these different instruments, and yeah, they're basically BS, and yeah, it could totally destroy everything. But at the end of the day, we know we'll get bailed out by the government, so we're just going to keep doing it. And then lo and behold, they crash the whole economy. They destroy millions of people's lives, make millions of people lose their houses, and then the government comes in and bails them out. And then, there was no consequence for their behavior. So they're back at it again. And then everyone blames the bankers, though, right? It's like, no, it's not. I mean, yeah, the bankers are at fault because they're trading it, but the bankers the free market flushes out bad actors, right? With reality and with consequences. Because if you had that where you lost your firm, $400 billion or anything like that, and you destroyed that value, you would never get a job ever again anywhere on Wall Street. Yet most of these guys are back at it doing it again because they got bailed out. So it's like the solution is not more regulation, it's less regulation and more consequences. Like, let reality happen to these folks. With the COVID stuff, it's like, let the firms that didn't plan well be destroyed, by whatever free market stuff happens with COVID. Obviously, no one could predict that the government came in and totally threw a whole wrench by shutting everyone else down. So that really sucks. But regardless, it's like, that's how things should be. Reality should be the arbiter of who lasts and who doesn't last. And thankfully, in a free market society, usually that ends up for the good of most people.
It makes me think of like, if you're looking at the 2008 crisis and your takeaway is like, well, the banks just need more regulation. It's like, think about a father whose little kid goes out and like punches another kid unprovoked, right? And then the other kid starts chasing down the little kid, and the little kid hides behind their dad, right? And the dad says to the other kid, "Hey, stop it, knock it off. You don't get to punch you don't get to attack my kid." And then, the other kid's like, "Well, your kid punched me." And he said, my kid's a perfect little angel, would never do that. Do you expect that kid to go do that again? And who's at fault there? Do you blame the kid, or do you blame the dad who's reinforcing this kind of bad behavior and is going to ultimately make it so that there are no consequences for that? Of course, it's not good that the kid punched the other kid unprovoked, but the root cause is a parent who is keeping their kid from consequences and not punishing bad behavior because he doesn't want the conflict. And the difference between a parent and the government in this example is the government has less incentive to make people behave well, because when they don't behave well, the government usually benefits too. And then you think about the COVID situation, and it's almost like, not only does the father and cover for the kid, the father told the kid, "Hey, that guy over there, he's an evil Nazi." And then the kid goes over and punches the other kid. It's like, you shut down the economy and then you bail everyone out and cause all these bad acts and stuff. You were the very cause of the malpractice to begin with. So it's just a wild scenario where we're more ready to blame people who are naturally going to take advantage of a system that gives them no consequences than the very entity that creates the situations for corruption to begin with.
Yeah. As you're talking about that, it made me think of there are those people, in most of the time they're only kids because they don't live very long, but they have something broken in their brain where they don't feel pain, right? Like they can't feel physical pain. And so at first you'd be like, wow, that's like a superhero power, right? Like you would love to not feel pain, until you realize that like pain helps you understand what you should and shouldn't do. And so I remember the story of this one poor kid. I think he only lived till the age of 12 or something, but at age 6, he broke his leg. And he walked around on it broken for a whole week before his parents understood, like, oh, he's got a broken leg right now. And that caused a bunch of damage. And I don't think he was ever able to walk properly ever again after that. And the market is, when even at its best, like, let's say everyone is like altruistic and trying to allocate resources the best way they can. And the government's a great way to allocate resources when people are in trouble. And on top of it, we have enough money. We're not in total amounts of debt. Like, even given all those things, it's still best to let people fail, right? To kind of harp on George W. Bush's too big to fail, philosophy. It's like, no, everyone is able to fail, and everyone should fail when they deserve it. And if you don't let them fail, like, it's a healthy thing for banks and things to fail when they mismanage money, because it clears them of bad actors. So
there's a reason why that's always like one of the first leadership principles you hear at motivational speakers from people who are wildly successful and really down to earth. They
fail fast.
They say, don't be afraid to fail and learn from it.
Yep. All right, we've got a post from an account, and they write, "It's not just that America breeds a violent disregard for human life, but that America is violence itself. In its every facet and manifestation, it has only ever known administering and distributing violence. It has never been able to build systems of care, healing, or equity. And I for a minute, I thought about not including this one because depending on the perspective, I guess, that you come from, this could be true, right? From your and I's perspective, and we're saying that like America, as in the American government, or the federal government and the state that declares wars unilaterally without approval of Congress and bombs little children in Middle Eastern countries. Like, I think you could say that that part of America is violence itself, and it's only ever known administering and distributing misery and pain to people. And it's basically its only point of existence is that. But this, I went and looked through this person's profile, and they're very much of the ilk that America and Western culture is just violence and awful. It's like, man, like, if you look at like mortality, human condition, the quality of human lives throughout all history, it kind of plods along on pretty much flat line for a long time until about the late 1800s, and then boom, it skyrockets off. The standards of living, the quality of life, the mortality rates, they all go up. Everyone is a lot better off. And it's like, coincidentally, Western culture really comes into its own. It has a lot of innovation. Like we were talking about earlier, one person now working a day produces, enough food, not just for themselves, but for potentially for a whole family, right? And then that's only exponentially gotten, better and better and better. In the past, I think it was in the past 30 years, we've basically reduced poverty to basically tiny. It's almost like not even on the chart anymore. I think it was like 60-70% of the world was living in severe poverty upwards of 30-40 years ago, and now it's less than 12%, which is really amazing. So I never really like people criticizing Western culture. I'm fine if you criticize Western governments, right? Federal governments, that's totally fine. But Western culture has done the most for society and for the world and the human condition than any force that we've seen.
Yeah, I agree. I take issue with the very fact of conflating America and the American government. That's, that let's make that a very clear distinction, because if we're talking about the government, then yeah, I don't really think it has been able to build systems of care, healing, or equity. Whether or not equity is necessarily a good thing or not, you can determine for yourself. But the principles of America of themselves and Western culture, you sort of have the culture of the Anglosphere is sort of what it was originally called. When you have like in particular UK, the US, and Australia, those sort of make up the Anglosphere. And culturally speaking, for a long time, these sort of three entities have more in common with each other than a lot of places do. I mean, I would say in many regards, the UK has much more culturally in common with the US than it does with other places in Europe. Now, obviously, it is part of Europe, and there are strong European ties there, so that's not always the case. But the UK is far more similar to the US than any other nation in Europe by far, and in many respects, it is more similar to the US than other European nations. And when you think about the ways in which the Anglosphere and that kind of culture has actually put a stop to violence in so many ways, it's pretty shocking and startling. Again, it's not good that these nations, in the U.S. and the U.K. in particular, took part in the slave trade. That was a horrible thing, but it is incredible that for the number of years that we had that horrible practice in the world, it's pretty amazing how quickly relative to its history, the U.S. and the U.K. Put an end to it. So to say America is violence itself is, I don't know. And you look at things like the idea of the Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta and the assertion of individual liberties and things like that, and it's like there was strong stands for individual freedoms against things like the government having control over people's bodies. Like, think about how for so many kingdoms in Europe and Asia and all over the place, the idea, it's kind of memed on, and it existed in England too for times, but the idea of prima nocta is a thing, right? Just like the idea that the king basically has such ownership over every single person in the land that he gets to sleep with any woman he wants on her bridal night, right? Like, he just owns people to that point. Like, that's crazy. And the fact that the Western cultures started building up sort of individual rights apart from government in and of itself is a massive departure from the idea of violence. The idea that people have their own rights and that you don't get to just do things violently to another person. That is a very Western idea, a very American idea. And so saying America is violence itself is just very, very not true.
Yeah.
There are a lot of aspects of America that have been violent. There are a lot of aspects of the American government that are currently violent. And these are terrible and these are bad. But you can't just look at things in a vacuum. You have to compare them to the rest of the world. And for all of its faults, America and Western culture have a pretty good track record of building systems of care and disavowing violence, even if it's not perfect.
There's this concept in business called product market fit, which is that when you develop a product, if you've got product market fit, like things just start happening. Customers buy it because they're like, wow, this helps and is useful and is valuable to me. And companies that get product market fit usually skyrocket up in terms of sales and growth and all that stuff. And it's really fast. It just happens is kind of the way they put it. And I liked your point about like the Magna Carta and Western culture, because we might do this post sometime, but you see these little charts that people leftists traditionally will post of like the history of America, and it will have like, like basically 90% of it will be like slavery was legal during this time and segregation was legal. And then there's just a little itty bitty sliver that says people have been free. And it's like, and people point this to be like, you see, like we're such a bad country, but for the majority of our time, we've been, awful and bad. And it's like, okay, now let's expand that chart to all of history. And it's basically like thousands of years of slavery and awfulness and bad things and violence. And then product market fit of Western, civilization and liberty ideals happens. And within 100 years, basically, of that philosophy being implemented, like slavery is taken away, and then within another 100 years of that, segregation is taken away. It's like, I think you've got something that fits pretty good right there. Like it's just happening now that this philosophy is being adhered to. And that's also on the point that like America's done some bad stuff, but all that bad stuff is in contradiction of the Western value set, in contradiction of liberty, and the principles that the founding fathers have. Like we haven't always lived up to those principles, but when you do live up to those principles, like really good things happen, and they happen really, really fast. There's a reason why America and the United Kingdom and all these different places were the first to get rid of slavery, and why today in basically almost all Western cultures you won't find any slavery, whereas the only places that slavery does exist is outside of Western cultures.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, to think that slavery's abolished worldwide is particularly naive. And even if you include major nations, it's like, look at what China's doing with the Uyghur Muslims, forced labor camps. And then they might come back and say, well, there's forced prison labor. And it's like, wait a second, forced prison labor? Well, who's in charge of the justice system in the United States? It's almost like it's the government, not the culture and the people. Yep. And every time you have slavery, it aligns with a particular strain of the idea of a certain subset of people being able to control and own the bodies of other people. And it usually comes sort of the antithesis of the American culture. The natural anti-government movement in America is at odds with the worst purveyors of slavery.
Speaking of ownership, our last post today has to do with property rights. And this user tweets out, property rights are a system of determining superior claims to possession and usage. Property taxes are a condition of ownership. Their existence does not negate someone's private property rights in their home. Your tweet is something a college freshman stoner might say. And this is basically a person saying, hey, property taxes are bad because it means that you can't own anything. And then this person posted a follow-up tweet to it saying, you have the right to sell or give your property away. Your right to sell or give it away is much stronger than the government's right to seize it, which may only occur under a very limited set of circumstances. And you and I were kind of scratching our heads about this one because it's just such a bizarre and weird claim. But I think what I appreciate about it is that it's very, I think this is how a lot of people that are very pro-big government think about property and everything that people own, is that it's conditional. Ownership is conditional. Where their logic breaks down is that it's like, well, then you don't actually own it, right? Like ownership has no conditions to it other than the fact that you own it. And yeah, if you don't maintain it or if you don't do something else, like nature might take it from you, right? If I don't maintain, if I don't maintain my car, and by driving around just by nature of it, I might not have a usable car at some point. What really got me though is the second tweet where there's, in the first one he says ownership or private property is about who has superior claims to possession and usage. And he's like, so that means you own it, but it's under conditions. And then the second one he says, the government can't seize it and you have the right to sell or give it away. It's much stronger than the government's. That's not true, because by you buying it, I don't know if anyone's here ever bought or sold a house. There's taxes that must be paid. You will not actually get the deed to your house. It's not certified until you pay taxes on it and you've put a certain amount of money away in escrow, because at the end of the day, even the people that have loaned you money for your house, if you default on the taxes, the government can take that property away and not pay the company that loaned you the money in the first place. That's why when you buy a house, you've got to put money into escrow for taxes, because mortgage companies are like, shoot, if this person's an idiot and they don't pay their taxes for this property, the government has more of a right to take it than the person that actually loaned the principal to the person that was purchasing it. That's how superior the government is in terms of their ownership rights to your property.
Let's even play a game with this person and say, all right, let's say you've purchased your property. Let's say you're good and you paid all those initial escrow, deals. You're in your house. You've owned it. You've paid it off. Okay, it is just you, this house, and government taxes. And you decide, well, you know what? My right to sell or give my property away is stronger than the government's right to seize it. So I'm going to sell my property and I'm not going to pay my property taxes. What do you think happens if you're not able to sell your property, let's say for 6 months, and you don't pay these property taxes? Do you think you can legally sell this property without it being seized? Or do you think the government says, no, you don't get to sell this and not owe these taxes? You owe the taxes and we're going to seize this property. We're at least going to prevent your sale of it. What a stupid thing to say. No, the right to sell or give it away isn't stronger than the government's right to seize it. The government can seize it if you don't pay your taxes on it. You can't just be like, oh, I'm not paying, and they're saying, all right, we're going to seize it, and then you pull out your Uno reverse card and saying, I'm going to sell it. You can't seize it now because I am going to sell it to Brit. Like, that's not how that works. They'd say, cool story, bro. We're seizing it because you owe us taxes. The other funny thing is in the first tweet, he goes, property taxes are a condition of ownership. Where's your sources? Trust me, bro. Why? Where do you get that? You're just making that assertion. You don't back it up. There's no
price
theory
of
of
society is the
exactly. There's no theory of property rights to say that property taxes are a condition of ownership, unless you go through and actually you actually have to explain that and rationalize that. You can't just make that claim without backing it up. Now, you can make that claim, but you have to again presume that the government owns everything as in the primacy over you for that to be true, which then specifically negates the points that he makes later, where to say that if property rights are a system of superior claims and your claim is superior than the government's, it's just a condition. Like you said at the beginning, then their claim is superior to yours if if it is conditional. You can't actually own anything. So to just to clarify that, just to make myself absolutely clear, his claim is property rights are a way of determining whose rights to something are superior. They're saying that property taxes, the government's portion of what you pay, is a condition of ownership, but the government has less of a right to it than you. But by saying that it's a condition of ownership, it has that necessarily means your property rights theory has to say the government, before you have a right to a piece of property, before anyone has a right. So they ultimately have the primacy of the rights. They are the highest on the hierarchy.
You have to satisfy their conditions.
Exactly. You have to satisfy their conditions in order to own that piece of property. So even if you own it, quote unquote, more, or own it more directly, the authority always hinges on the condition of ownership, which the government has to first own in order to give out. So this is just kind of a circular logic where he doesn't explain where he gets the conditional ownership claim, because if he did, he'd have to admit that it means government has the primacy rights over you.
Yep. And this like people will say things like, well, that's the social contract, right? They'll use terms like that, and we hear it all the time. Which I would posit, it's like, okay, like in a contract, you've got two parties that have, in an ethical, moral contract, you've got two parties that have mutually agreed to enter into the contract with a set of conditions, and part of a contract means that there's also a set of conditions where you can exit and part ways peacefully. What part of the social contract allows you to opt out? There is no opting out. There's only one party in the social contract that can opt out, and they can do it unilaterally, at the behest of the majority voting for one way or the other. And the part where he says, the government's right to seize it, which may occur only under a very limited set of circumstances. It's like, this is the same argument and the same standpoint of like, you move into a neighborhood, you open up a restaurant, and the local mafia notices you're making some money, so they say, hey, like, part of you being able to operate in here means that you've got to give me 10% of everything that you make. And it's like, you still own it. It's still yours. But if you don't pay me this 10%, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to take everything that you've got. It's like, okay, yeah, you own it, but you don't actually own it. You're not free to interact with it. It's like, you're not just because you operate it and you own it and all these different things, it does not mean that you're actually stronger than the entity enforcing those restrictions on you, because at any point they can come and say, hey, we're going to take this from you because we deem it necessary and need it. And people will be like, well, you're comparing the mafia to the government. It's like, yeah, I am, because the government can literally do that. The government can say, for any reason, any way that they want, they can come and say, hey, eminent domain, I'm going to take your property from you. And they can take it with compensation or without compensation. I've seen it done plenty of times without compensation or fair compensation, just because of some different types of loopholes. So,
well, and not even, they don't even have to give a reason, because as long as they declare that the piece of property is within the United States territory ownership, then you owe taxes on it, on that condition of ownership. There's that right again coming in first and foremost. Yep. Your point on the social contract makes me think of some of the memes, and I'm going to amend it here a little bit and sort of adapt it to this. But it's it's something like, what makes you purchasing something from a store not extortion is consent, right? The idea that you're voluntarily buying the Snickers from the cashier who voluntarily wants your money. That's a healthy exchange of the Price is Right. Consent. What makes sex not rape is consent. When two people sleep together and both parties consent, then it's not rape. And so in this case, like, what makes this, this contract not, what makes the social contract, what would make it an actual contract is consent. But consent is never given in a social contract. Yep. And if you used any of the shoddy reasoning that people do on the social contract to say it's implicit, that would not fly. Well, she didn't say no. That doesn't fly when it comes to rape, because of course it doesn't. Consent cannot, by the definition of consent, cannot be given implicitly. Consent in a contract scenario has to be expressly written. It wouldn't be held up in a court of law. It wouldn't be to say, well, I left the contract out on the table and I told her about it multiple times, and I said if she didn't want it, she should shred it, and she didn't shred it, so she implicitly gave her consent. No court of law would ever hold that up, rightfully so, because that's a ridiculous thing to say, that it was implied consent. So people say that, by the property, or by the fact that you live and you use the government roads. Again, the exact same argument could be used for the mafia setting up in the restaurant. By the fact that the mafia went out and stopped a robber from taking your supplies for you, well, you didn't let the robber come in. You didn't give the robber the money he was going to steal. So, you sort of implicitly agreed to their contract because you used their service. It's like, try to go a day in the United States without, stepping on some territory that the government has staked out for itself. You can't. Just in the same way that you can't go a day without breaking a law, basically. You can't go a day without using some aspect of something that the government's done, because they're so ingrained in even the U.S. society. So it's an absurd claim to say that you can implicitly consent to these kinds of things through the social contract, and that because you've implicitly consented, then the government has primacy of the condition of ownership for things like that. It's a complete farce, and anyone who seriously thinks about it needs to kind of be laughed out of the room if they come to the conclusion that implicit consent is okay.
Totally agree. Any more on this one?
Nope, I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us for the show. We had a really great time. If you have any other thoughts that you want to add or any of the Cringe posts that you would like us to take on, feel free to message us at Cringe Post Pod on all of our social media, and we will catch you next time.